Presently, it is the 300th anniversary of the end of the Western culture, which lasted from 1540 to 2093. In this documentary, we seek to understand the present in the Second People's Republic of China by reconstructing the global past. We try to address the question of how our ancestors, despite their knowledge about the climate change, failed to take action as their civilization fell into the Dark Age. Throughout history, numerous civilizations rose and fell, but the fall of the Western culture is extensively documented in electronic formats. The consequences of its actions were predicted, but the knowledge did not translate into power. For example, the Western world knew that carbon dioxide and water vapor absorbed heat in the atmosphere. Cambria, Nordic Scandinavian Union, and the United States of North America have all contributed to the CO2 release during the Industrial Revolution, which lasted from 1750 to 2050. While the 20th century physical scientists took note of the CO2 release, many argued that the solution to pollution is dilution. However, it was noticeable that some chemicals, such as DDT and CFC, had extremely powerful effects even at low concentrations. The biosphere was affected. A large number of species of fish, birds, and mammals lost habitats as a result of fossil fuel combustion, concrete manufacture, deforestation, and agricultural techniques. Another consequence was that the ozone layer in the stratosphere was being depleted. The findings of these harmful effects during the Anthropocene period were accidental. For instance, many discoveries were byproducts of nuclear weapon testing and development. Paul Ehrlich first noticed the limits of planetary sinks in his book The Population Bomb, but the publication barely reached any concerns. In the U.S., those who were concerned celebrated the first Earth Day on April 22, 1970, and the Environmental Protection Agency was established. By the late 1980s, some groups began to promote transitioning to a non-carbon-based energy system as a way to limit greenhouse gas emission. Year 1988 marked the beginning of the penumbral period, when world scientific and political leaders created the IPCC to protect the planet. A year later, the Montreal Protocol to control substances that deplete the ozone layer was signed. These efforts led many nations to sign the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, to stop human pollution. However, many critics from the U.S. claimed that the scientific uncertainties were too great to be putting in so much effort into greenhouse gas elimination. They said that it costs more than it is worth. While some nations attempted to counteract this view, soon open climate change denial predominated in industrial countries. Underdeveloped countries, on the other hand, viewed the danger claims as a way to prevent their development.
China was the sole nation that took steps to control its population and convert its economy to non-carbon-based energy sources. This was not noticed by the West, in part because they viewed China's population control as immoral, and because the dramatic increase in greenhouse gas emissions that occurred in China due to their rapid economic growth hid the impact that renewable energy had in the country. By the early 2000s, there were many life-threatening anthropogenic interferences in the climate system developing. These were seen by the heightened intensity of fire, hurricanes, floods, and heat waves experienced worldwide. Even though the changes in the climate system were extraordinarily relevant, people did not believe in the negative impacts that greenhouse gas emissions had on our planet. There were two types of denial, one active denial and the other passive denial. Active denial characterized individuals who disclaimed the evidence of climate change and insisted that the extreme weather events were due to natural variability in the climate. Passive denial, on the other hand, characterizes individuals who were indifferent. They continued living their lives and were untrustworthy that any changes in the environment resulted from industry or infrastructure. Physical scientists were of no help in dealing with this epidemic denial. They focused on singular events instead of showcasing and appropriately explaining that the world should not fear a single hurricane or flood, but instead the major impact of the shifting climate, which is illustrated by the impact on the cryosphere and the drastically increasing acidification of the world's oceans. The year 2009 was known as the last best chance the Western world had to save itself. as leaders met in Copenhagen, Denmark, to try, for the 15th time since the UNFCCC was written, to agree on a much-needed international law to prevent disrupted climate change. Ironically enough, 2 years before, the IPCC had written that anthropogenic warming was unequivocal, and public polls show that a majority of people, even people in resisting countries like the United States, believed that action was needed. But before the UNFCCC meeting, there was an extensive campaign launched to discredit the scientists whose research built the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's conclusion 2 years earlier. This abrasive campaign was funded by fossil fuel corporations. At the time, many large fossil fuel corporations' annual profits exceeded the GDPs of most countries. Now, GDP is not used to assess well-being, but rather the much more valuable Boothanian concept of gross domestic happiness. Due to these campaigns and the inability of scientists to persuade people and gain their credibility back, public support for action diminished. All the while, climate change was intensifying. In 2010, 50,000 people were killed in Russia by record-breaking summer heats and fires. This resulted in more than $15 billion in damages. A year later, massive floods in Australia troubled more than 250,000 people. In the United States, the year 2012 was known as the year without a winter. The infamous year of perpetual summer was in 2023, when 500,000 people died worldwide and cost $500 billion in losses due to fires, crop failure, and the deaths of livestock and companion animals. Even after these increasingly devastating blows to humanity, political, business, and religious leaders refused to accept that the cause of them was the burning of fossil fuels. The concept was extremely simple. If more heat was emitted into the atmosphere, then more energy had to be absorbed, and this manifested in more destructive storms, more powerful floods, and deeper and longer droughts. People were incompetent and could not grasp this concept. This period of ignorance and denial is what is now known as the period of the penumbra. It is obvious that immediate steps should have been taken in the early 21st century to begin a transition to a zero-net carbon world, but absurdly, the opposite occurred. At the very time that measures should have and could have been taken, greenhouse gas emissions increased.